At the beginning of the Vietnam conflict, President Truman and then President Eisenhower both agreed to support South Vietnam. These were more words than they were actions. President Eisenhower fought for the preservation of capitalism and the extinction, or at the very least, the stopping of the spread of communism. He supported the so-called domino effect, which said that once one nation falls to communism, more will follow. This bled over into the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations and heavily influenced how they dealt with Vietnam. Beginning with Kennedy, which is one of the administrations that I will discuss in conjunction with the Johnson administration, Vietnam was treated as though at any moment North Vietnam and China would completely take over and the rest of Asia would fall to communism. Kennedy built upon Eisenhower's beliefs of the domino effect, and though Eisenhower had already committed several military advisors and he had committed quite a bit of money and other resources to the effort, Kennedy more than doubled the amount of money sent to South Vietnam, as well as staggeringly increasing the number of military advisors in the country. Once Johnson took office, he continued this escalation. He began bombing raids, actual war, all-out war, as well as guerrilla war, and he even convinced Congress to pass a bill giving him what he believed was the authority to begin a war without their approval. One of the issues that came up in the Vietnam conflict was the idea that the Buddhists of the nation more strongly supported communism, such as in China, whereas the Catholics of the nation more strongly seemed to support the South. However, this is also a skewed statistic. Many of the Vietnamese were not necessarily on any side. They simply wanted an end to the conflict. But this was perpetuated by Western influence, CIA programs that were meant to destabilize, and pamphlets being dropped off that were condemning communism and pushing people to surrender or migrate to the South, especially if they were Catholic. This was in hopes that someone who took power in South Vietnam would be able to control all of Vietnam, originally through a vote, but eventually just based on sheer numbers. Both Kennedy and Johnson enjoyed, or at the very least, saw the necessity for using both fear and propaganda to gain support for the war or for their administrations here in the U.S. The fear of communism, the domino effect, did a great deal to give them more authority and allow them to use more U.S. resources in the conflict. Johnson, for example, used the incidents in the Gulf of Tonkin, where he claimed that a U.S. ship was being fired upon on two different occasions for no reason. One of the occasions, it turned out, was at the very least complicated, if not justified. The other incident actually appears to have never occurred. However, despite knowing that this was the case, Johnson moved forward and used it to gain congressional approval for essentially starting the war without Congress's war approval. both of them also feared the Republican supporters of the domino effect. So even though they had their reasons for wanting to go to war in Vietnam or thinking it was necessary, they were also afraid of not going to war and backing down, even whenever it seemed as though that was necessary, because they were afraid that Republican war hawks would end up seizing power at the next election or even taking power in Congress, and things would go much, much worse. For Kennedy, it's almost guaranteed that he was worried that the civil rights movement would be hindered if he were to allow them to take power. Johnson made the famous comment that we will stand in Vietnam. This was due to heavy criticism and heavy uncertainty as to what would occur. Strategically, both presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, believed that Vietnamization would be the best opportunity for a U.S. victory in Vietnam. The training of Vietnamese troops, preferably in South Vietnam, but also some in North Vietnam, to combat the communist regime, would potentially win the war. Unfortunately, this was not well implemented, and the South Vietnamese armies were simply not big enough, not well enough organized, and not nearly passionate enough to win this conflict. This was partially due to so much heavy fighting and so much destruction, but also due to the fact that while Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Cong, was a war hero, revolutionary hero. So imagine someone like George Washington being your enemy. And the South Vietnamese leadership was constantly changing and almost always corrupt and oppressive. So on the one hand, you have communism, which has been touted to be evil, oppressive, and destructive. And on the other, you have a government that you know with first-hand knowledge wants power, wants inequality, and will strangle out any dissension. For these reasons, as well as others, unfortunately, Vietnam was almost certainly a misstep in American history. And the presidents involved, Kennedy and Johnson especially, moved rashly and without regard to the history of Vietnam or the governments that they were propping up to combat communism. Thank you.